Harry Broadman is a former chief of staff for the US President's Council of Economic Advisers who's worked under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. He joins us now live from Washington, D.C. Good to have you with us, Harry.
Thank you.
So how quickly does all of what we've been talking about for the last few minutes translate into real pain for the US economy?
Well, there are two elements. One is psychological and emotional, which tends to be transmitted quite quickly, and I think that's sort of where we are now. And then the question is, how quickly has that gone through the supply chain? And again, the input prices into the supply chain now are also being affected psychologically. So there's the consumer end in the US, and then there's the supply chain effects, which could be affected, quite soon, both whether it's petroleum or fertilizer, as we've just heard.
Harry, if you were advising President Trump and his team at the moment, what would you be telling them?
Well, I guess, I think the question is what can be done, and one element in the arsenal is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That's certainly one idea. The other is to prod allies, other oil-producing allies, to open up the spigot a bit. But this is a careful balancing act that has to be struck. And then the question is, if you ask other countries to open up the spigot, they're going to want something in return when things quiet down, unless they make a lot of money, which they could. So it's a delicate balancing act. But I think the most important thing is, I think voters, as they begin to think about the midterms, are already mindful of the potential impact that these rising prices really could have on who they want to have in the congressional seats.
Are you talking, Harry, about inflation? I mean, Americans already seeing rising gasoline prices, although the price of a barrel of oil dropped back from $100 a barrel today. Does a sustained spike risk reigniting inflation? I mean, just as the Federal Reserve thought that perhaps it was getting it under control.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as I say, it really is a supply chain effect. And it's the question is the price of crude oil, then you get to the refined products, then you get to even more refined gasoline and the like. And every chink along the supply chain, there could be an added wedge of higher prices, which then reveals itself at the gasoline pump, which is most visible to the United States consumers. But then it's also coming in the supply chain into factories. And the costs of what we've just been talking about become embodied in manufactured goods, and the delivery costs. If it becomes more expensive to truck these goods from the port to the stores, that also is going to be quite visible. So there's a number of dimensions here at play. It's not just psychologically, people tend to think of the gasoline pump. That's a metaphor, but I think there could be a much broader base expectations for inflation.
So what, Harry, will economists like you be watching out for most closely over the days and weeks ahead to judge whether this conflict has become a serious economic shock?
Well, I think, as I noted, I think the psychological effects are, already there. And I think what people will look at, and what I look at, what steps are going to be taken to ameliorate those. And I believe, as we just heard, the president is talking about this. The question is, what is happening at the U.S. Department of Energy in terms of dealing with allies who might, pump more into the system? What are we thinking about in terms of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and tapping into that? But there's no denying that, when you have a major war in the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz is blockaded, it's inescapable. So the question is, what's the best way? I think, certainly you've got to be honest with the U.S. consumers, but you also have to be transparent about, here are the 4 or 5 steps that we're doing, and sort of lay those out.
Harry Broadman, former chief of staff for the US President's Council of Economic Advisers. Harry, good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you.